All right, my AP language friends. So Kristian Kuhn coming at you again with a writing workshop, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And in today's writing workshop, we're going to take a look at the FRQ 2 from the 2023 exam, set 2, the Rita commencement speech. So what I'll do in this video is kind of stick to status quo. I'm going to show you how my students would manipulate my template of the declarative thesis to house their introductory paragraph. And I have like 3 exemplars that my students wrote in which they'll demonstrate for you how they pull the strings of my template come exam time. And then we'll move into the body paragraphs and use my template of the syllogistic method. And then I got some conclusion paragraphs for you to see. So if you're going to use this in your classroom and have your students write along, there's just natural pause points. So after we do the introduction, pause, have your students write. After we do the first premise, pause, write, etc., and just kind of follow our lead here. So without further ado, how about we take a look at the prompt and get our heads around the task here. So the College Board is asking our students to do the following here. On May 21st, 2016, the poet Rita delivered a commencement address to graduating students at the University of Virginia at Charlottesville, where she was a professor of English at the time. Dove received a Pulitzer Prize for her poetry and served as the United States Poet Laureate from 1993 to 1995. She also writes in a variety of genres, including fiction and drama. The following is an excerpt from her speech. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Dove makes to convey her message about what she wishes for her audience of graduating students. All right, so there's just a couple of things that I would pick out of there if I were to write this on exam day. One, they kind of belie her ethos a little bit, right? She's a very accomplished writer. And as the speech will tell us, poet laureate, guest to the White House, very accomplished career as a writer and as an academic. And then they kind of hint at what she's going to do in the speech. They say the word wish, what she wishes for her students or, for the audience. So you got 2 things there that you got to have your antennae up for as you read this passage. So the next question is this: as we show how to demonstrate how to write this. How do I write the introductory paragraph? Oh, what a godless feeling it would be for a student to show up to the exam on exam day, be asking that question and drawing blanks, right? So my students intuitively, instinctually know how to do this because I modeled it all year long for them. They know that they're going to declare the thesis. So how about we take a look at that? First, let me explain something. To get my students to write at the caliber that you're going to see in just a second, I had to Bob Ross my instruction from day one. And here's what I mean by that. By Bob Rossing my instruction, I know the fundamental difference between the assigning of writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. I love it when teachers position themselves as the expert writers in the classroom and they get to the proverbial canvas and easel and they paint exemplars and models with their students, just like Bob Ross always walked us through the painting. And when I assign writing, I always walk my students through it. Up until March 1st, I always tell them I cease to be the Bob Ross of instruction come March 1st. That way they have 2 months to practice on their own without scaffolds and training wheels. So Bob Ross used a heuristic called the wet on wet technique and to paint every natural landscape. And my students, and even myself, I just use declarative inverted for the introductory paragraph and then syllogistic template for the body paragraphs. So let me tell you about a little cheat code, a little hack of the exam. And this is true for FRQ 1 and FRQ 2 for the AP Literature exam. So in my school, students take Lang with me and then they move on to Lit. So we have that cycle of doing an honors program in 10th grade, 11th grade, we do Lang, senior year, we do Lit. So there are 2 implicit questions in every rhetorical analysis prompt. And if students can ascertain a correct read of the passage and answer these 2 questions, they're going to guarantee themselves the thesis point. So the first question is, what is the author's intent? Second question is, how does the author construct meaning? In a second here, I'm going to show you the declarative thesis template, but let me break down the math a little bit for this. My thesis templates require 4 sentences. So every introductory paragraph that my students write, no matter the expository mode, is always going to be 4 sentences long. What they do is something called 3+1. They're going to take 3 sentences to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? And 1 sentence, what is the author's intent? The trick is this. Whenever a student answers, how does the author construct meaning, that's the articulation of the thesis statement. Because as soon as you drop terms, devices, techniques, that's a reader's indication of ka-ching, thesis statement, right? So typically that's a safe bet. So if they read it correctly, answer these 2 questions out of the gate, they're going to come out swinging. They're going to come out with some blazing fire. But let's talk about reading real quick. So my students read a lot of rhetorical analysis pieces over the course of the year. I really don't teach too many full-length text in AP Lang. I find I get more bang for my buck just doing short pieces. I think students are underread and they need to see a wide variety of things. So we read, just short things like this often. And I have an easel in my room, and every time we read a rhetorical analysis piece and discover a new term, device, or technique, it goes onto the easel. I have these little laminate Velcro term, device, technique placards that we attach to the easel. So what we did to break this down was we read the speech aloud, and as students identified terms, devices, techniques, they went to the easel, grabbed that placard, and put it on the whiteboard. Typically, what students do in terms of answering the question, how does the author construct meaning, is they focus on the 3, sometimes 4. You don't want it to be a terms dumping ground. So 3 of the most salient moves the author makes in the particular address or passage that you're looking at. And you'll see in a second what my students decided to do. So I tell them as they read, go term, device, technique, hunting, right? You got to go hunting and identify those particular terms, devices, techniques to be a good reader. And the cool thing is they just recur over and over and over again. New passage, same old techniques. There's only so many things an author can do in terms of rhetoric. And before long, they're going to see every possible angle that's going to be thrown at them on the exam. So I felt like my kids were pretty prepared this year. The College Board didn't throw any zingers at them. So let's talk about the declarative thesis. So I already alluded to this. When you declare, you begin with the thesis. So you're going to begin by answering the question, how does the author construct meaning? Focus on the most salient, most relevant term or terms and drop it as succinctly as possible. From there, you're going to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background. This is where the authorial intent's going to come in. Students got to cop an academic tone, so I like to see tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I do an intensive word study with my students because I know that there's a seismic vocabulary void at the beginning of the year, and I help augment my students' vocab very deliberately over the course of the academic year. So you're going to see my students wield some nice diction and wield some nice sentence constructs. I borrow heavily from Strunk and White's seminal text called Write It Right. And in it, they have something called rule number 18, and they espouse the idea that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So you'll see my students achieve some nice voice rhythm and flow, which is essential to get the sophistication point. And as I've already stated, it's got to be 4 sentences long. So let's just review this. 3+1. You're going to see this every single time in the 3 exemplars here. 3 sentences, construction of meaning. 1 sentence, authorial intent. So let's see what my good students did. This is student number 1. Primarily through anecdote and enumeration. So do you see immediately you begin with the terms and devices. So I tell my students focus on the most salient ones. So primarily through anecdote and enumeration, Dove chooses to go the route of the poet in the guise of a nightingale instead of a hardline advice giver in her commencement address to UVC. Embracing her ethos as a former poet laureate and accomplished presence in the world of academia, she waxes the extension of her wisdom anecdotally through a series of negations. Placing herself in the company of other established artists. So you got those references in there to other artists, other accomplished musicians and artists, writers. She expounds upon the various ways these graduates can lead lives as extraordinary as hers. Given that life is not always a smooth ride, her main point is that no matter what, anyone can overcome life's obstacles if they put forth an effort that exceeds the limits of mere preparedness. And that encapsulates everything very well. So it definitely focuses on the key rhetorical features of the passage. The vocab is up without sounding contrived or pretentious. This kid stays in his wheelhouse pretty nice, and those sentence constructs are nice and supple. So one piece of advice I give my students is this, especially in the introduction, there's probably no need to be paralleling your sentences in an introduction. So I tell my students, switch up your sentence constructs. So like if you wrote an independent clause to lead, don't do another short, simple declarative sentence. Otherwise, you're going to get that da-dot kind of rhythm. So in these, note how my students are always switching up their sentence constructs, and they're very well versed with their grammar, their punctuation, their syntax. That's part of my Nuance Academy. They really don't make mistakes all that often. I skill and drill them on that. So I think out of the gate, if this kid can sustain this for the duration of his paper, he's definitely in contention of the unicorn, the sophistication point. This is some pretty solid writing. So let's do that again and have student number 2 step to the plate and deliver. So student number 2 wrote this. From the vantage point of a long list of accomplishments, everything from being a former poet laureate to an esteemed White House guest, Dove decides it best to not dispense a tepid listing of life advice, but to instead gift the graduates of UVC with other sweet sounds. Chiefly through anecdote, she enumerates all of her wishes for these young graduates as they embark upon their life's journey. Aligning herself with other accomplished artists, she implores her audience to hone in on their preparedness as they face the inevitable ups and downs of life. Much like herself, if these graduates embrace the tenets of her wishes, they too can overcome anything and lead lives of remarkable quality. So as you can see here, it's another quintessential declarative thesis, 3+1. Focus on the terms, devices, techniques, the construction of meaning, encapsulate that, house it in 3 sentences, 1 sentence authorial intent, and that's the magic recipe. Seems hard, perhaps, if you're new to this, but yes, you can. You can do this with practice. And teachers, if you're looking at this and saying, whoa, my students can't do this, you got to get to the proverbial easel and canvas, paint, show them how to do it, because students absolutely can do this. This is a far cry from what my students were doing the day after Labor Day in September when I inherited them at the beginning of the academic year. So this takes lots and lots and lots of practice. So student number 3 comes to the piece of paper, picks up a pen, and writes the following. Leaning on her long list of accomplishments as a poet and academic, Dove deviates from the typical script of a run-of-the-mill commencement address and embraces her inner nightingale to deliver a few pearls of wisdom to the graduating class of UVC. Enumerating her ardent wishes for them, she anecdotally details a few tales of her life in hopes of inspiring these young and aspiring graduates. In comparing her story to the lives of other great artists, including the life of her father, she emphasizes her main point. To live a stellar life, one must focus on their preparedness. Knowing that their lives will not always be smooth sailing, she encouraged the graduates to live with passion and an embracing will to tackle it all. So there's a common thread in all of these. And, each instance, all 3 of these, my students focused on the 3 most salient terms, devices, techniques. So you got to demonstrate that you've read the piece correctly, right? So you got to read correctly. State that in the thesis, 3 sentences construction of meaning, 1 sentence authorial intent. And then if you can wield the vocab like this and the sentence constructs like this, you're definitely in contention for sophistication all day long. So I think the moral of the story is, have a really good word study academy, and have a good nuance academy in your instruction, and the sky's the limit for your student writers. So if you're using this in your classroom as a writing workshop, I would pause right here and have your students practice a declarative thesis. And as always, I'm a big proponent of this. The more writing students can see, the better they become. So ask for a few volunteers to share theirs, and even, teachers, you draft a few yourselves and show your students to demystify it and put it in their wheelhouse so that they can crush it. So let's move on. Next question is this. We're done with the introductory paragraphs. So we have to ask ourselves this. So how do I write the body paragraphs? And for those that are familiar with my work, you know that we always proceed syllogistically. Let me give a quick cursory overview of what the syllogistic method is for those that are unfamiliar with it. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the town boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they would throw out juicy questions. And you see this in a seminal text, Plato's Republic. What is justice is the essential question that they grapple with. And all these great philosophical think takers, scholars, philosophers go to the proverbial mic and they drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle, much like us composition teachers, scratched his head and he's like, dude, why is it that some of my students absolutely crush debates? They're like masters at oration and polemics. And some of my students are men. Some of my students tank bomb it. And one day, as he was pondering that, he had a eureka moment, and he said, I got it. My really good orators, they are using something called the syllogistic method. They have a very mathematical, computative, deliberate, formulaic approach to their logic and reasoning. And as composition instructors, we use the buzzwords, line of reasoning. And basically, if a student can create a syllogism, a cogent syllogism in their writing, then they're going to stay very organized and hammer home their points very mathematically. So if I were to say to you, premise number 1, arsenic is deadly, you'd all say, yep, Kristian, you're right. That's absolute truth. But then if I throw you premise number 2 and say, my dog ate arsenic, your brows are going to furrow a little bit and say, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not good news for your dog. It's probably going to die. And Aristotle would refer to that as a cogent argument. It's logical. It's bulletproof. It makes sense. And when students write, they need to be that deliberate and that computative in their approach. So if we take the syllogistic method just in terms of first premise, second premise, conclusion, and turn it into a template for the purposes of performing rhetorical analysis, this is what the parts look like. The first premise is going to be an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. Some of you are familiar with my work that I do with literature. So the first premise never changes. And this is the cool thing. If you use my templates in language and your kids move on to lit, nothing changes. So you write FRQ 1, 2, and 3 from the AP literature exam the exact same way as you do this. The template never changes. So the first premise is an argument containing the terms, devices, techniques. It takes 3 sentences. On FRQ 1, the College Board says, your argument must be central 3 times. And I wish they would say it on all of the FRQs, because we are engaging in expository writing, which is an act of argumentation. So it's vital that kids argue in those first 3 sentences. So I don't want any quotes, paraphrases, nothing, no summation, just a literary argument that encompasses 3 sentences. The second premise is going to be the textual support. And this is going to come in the form of quoting and paraphrasing. And then the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph is where you're going to make your links and your echoes back to the thesis and the prompt. So all of this has some math to it. 3 sentences first premise, and then the total body paragraph, the length is going to be 10 to 12 sentences. I'm a firm believer, steadfast believer, that our kids that write those 4 or 5 sentence bagger paragraphs are not going to score well on the exam. There's just absolutely not enough support and analysis in 4 or 5 sentences to really advance and flesh out an argument. So I like my students to take on a little bit more and go 10 to 12 sentences. So you might ask yourself, what is a first premise? What does that look like? And in it, I have some stems that I would like to give to you and your students. So literally steal my first 4 words and the comma. All right, so if you're writing with me, just steal my first 4 words right from the onset, comma. My students often use this to begin their first body paragraph or something closely akin to it. It cues the reader into knowing that you have a chronology, you have a sequence, that you're going to be organized. Students often ask, where do I begin? And I say, begin where Dove begins. So we're going to start right where Dove starts and just go cherry picking our terms, devices, techniques. So look what happens here. Right from the onset, Dove immerses her accomplished persona right into the central spotlight of her address. So we got ethos. With a slight twist of humor, she decides to follow the dictates of her inner poet and break from the cliche and predictable nature of the typical commencement address. As a preeminent literary figure, she finds it best to fictionalize her intent and bestow wishes instead of empty advice. So if you look at the top of the passage, the top of the address, that's exactly what she does in those opening lines. I call this multitasking. Oftentimes, students will do 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction. No way you're getting the sophistication point if you proceed through the analysis that way. It's too dutiful, it's too elementary, too basic. Kids got to see how the parts interact with the whole. And this first premise is really a nice template, a nice, way to get them to meld the terms, the devices, the techniques together. So just to reiterate here, first premise is 3 sentences long. Focus on the rhetorical aspects of the piece. So in terms of opening up the lid of my brain and how I write these, after I write my first premise, I usually stop, go back to my text, look at my annotations, and grab all the quotes that I want to use in my body paragraph. So it's kind of like a cerebral graphic organizer step, if you will, because you got to keep the promise of the first premise, right? The first premise is a promise. And because you said those things, you've now promised your reader certain quotes and or paraphrases in the second premise. So let's see what this student did to go through the whole thing. So another sentence stem is this. My students begin the second premise with the word immediately. So immediately, comma. So you tie it right back to right from the onset. Immediately, Dove leans on the fact that she's a former poet laureate with a long list of accolades and announces that although she has given commencement speeches before, this one is different. This is personal. Typically, commencement addresses strictly adhere to a prescriptive formula. In fact, as she states rather flippantly, she Googled it, so it must be true. Her purpose is to dispense life advice. So you can see here, go back to the first premise. These quotes and paraphrases are all germane to my first promise in the first premise, right? So your quotes and paraphrases have to be very deliberate. Let's talk about quoting smoothly, having silky smooth quote transitions. I use something called the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. You'll see my students bracket quite a bit to keep that conversational flow going. So that needs to be taught. That needs to be Bob Ross. But in her first of several references to famous artists, she draws upon an opining line from one of literature's most accomplished poets, Shelley. Given that Dove, an accomplished poet herself, agrees with the sentiment of one of literature's best, Dove decides to embrace her contrary fairy godmother and wily genie to extend to the graduates a few wishes. So you can see here, this is staying really, really, really lockstep, cogent with the promise of the first premise. So going on here, enumerating her 3 gifts, she begins by saying, I wish you hunger. In her first 2 such decrees, Dove immediately negates in the denotative implications of the statement and clarifies her remark by stating that she does not mean physiological want, but a continued spiritual and intellectual appetite, a hunger to know more, do more, feel more. So it's quote, paraphrase, support analysis, a 1-2 punch, right? Well, you just can't quote dump. You got to analyze it. You got to unpack it. Later in her second wish, she qualifies her wish of hard work by commenting that she does not mean backbreaking labor, not the drudgery of the treadmill, but an appreciation for the work that comes before the big show. With both wishes, Dove is speaking figuratively in that she wants these graduates to embrace the fundamental purpose of an education, to forever remain intellectually engaged, and to put forth their best self at every phase of the game. So that takes us to the end of the second premise, right? We're still in this first paragraph. We have to cross the finish line. You just can't run away from your analysis. You got to remember to throw a conclusion on there. This usually takes 2 sentences, sometimes 3 sentences for my students, and you wrap it all back to the first premise. So a syllogism's a circle. So look what happens here. By throwing the typical script out the window, Dove is able to suggest that the foundation she built for herself to be as accomplished as she is can be attained by these graduates. They just need to embrace the wishes and do the work. And that is how you do a syllogistic body paragraph. So again, if you're following my lead, pause the video here, have your students craft a first premise, 3-sentence first premise, go quote hunting, and then write the whole thing, 10 to 12 sentences. So the question becomes this, because we're not done with the essay. You just can't write an intro in one body. What do you do next? And it's easy. You bust out another syllogism. Every body paragraph you ever write can be written syllogistically. So what you're going to do is you still have the middle of the passage left to analyze. You got to go all the way to the bottom. Switch up your terms, devices, techniques. Switch up your quotes. Switch up your paraphrases and analyze the rest. So my students always do 4 paragraphs, intro, 2 bodies, conclusion for all of the FRQs. And so that's how you would do the body paragraphs. So let's wrap this essay up and jump to the conclusion paragraph. So in my YouTube channel, I have a video on my sentence stems for conclusions. And basically a quick, rundown of this is I have my students end with like a thematic fireworks display, kind of like the climatic crescendo of, a fireworks display, the end. And I just want a real heavy focus on theme. Take 3 to 4 sentences to wrap it up. So take a look at one student's here. When one boils down all the possible pearls of wisdom one could bestow upon a graduating class, Dove's wish list offers a unique twist. If the soul stays hungry, prepares without relent, and embraces the rocky times, life can be a very special journey. Having lived by the rules of these wishes, Dove is a perfect case in point to verify the truth of her statements. And that takes us to the end, my friends. So one of the things I always say at the end of my videos is this: happy teaching and happy writing. I hope that serves you well and you can use it for your students to really crank a killer FRQ2 on the exam and to crush every rhetorical analysis going forward. So to wrap things up, note that I am a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. We offer PD throughout the calendar year, and we got a cool one for the summer. We're doing FRQ boot camp for lit and lang. So if you want to focus a PD, have a PD that focuses exclusively on the composition of AP language and composition, then come join us. It's a super affordable course. I think the National Writing Project is the most affordable, PD PD on the planet. So come check it out. There's more information at teachinghowtowrite.com. That's my website. There's some freebies on there as well. Go to the My NWP courses and just click on the AP Lang FRQ Bootcamp. There's a self-paced course. I have my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind as well. So tons of PD opportunities. Some are even free. So help yourself to that. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to give me an email at teachingwritingcoach at gmail.com. So for now, be well, be happy, happy teaching, happy writing.